My name is Charlene Reinders, and I am honored to be the program director for the League of Women Voters Salt Lake. I want to welcome our speakers, who I'll introduce in a few minutes, and our guests both in person and on Zoom. We like to start our meetings by making our land acknowledgement. We are gathered here in the Salt Lake Valley, which has always been a gathering place for Indigenous people. And we acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute people, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute nations, and is a crossroads for Indigenous peoples. We pay respect to the elders, past and present. We all consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that are our history and legacy, and seek to uncover the truth. For 100 years, over 100 years, the League of Women Voters has been a nonpartisan, activist, grassroots organization that believes voters should play a role in democracy. We encourage informed and active participation in government. We work to increase an understanding of major public policy issues and influence public policy through education and advocacy. Simply put, our mission is to empower voters and defend democracy. A recording of tonight's event will be made available to the public on the League of Women Voters Salt Lake website. Other recordings of this event may not be used without the express written approval of the League. The League will only allow audio, video of this event to be broadcast in its entirety, except by media reporting the event. So we will now move to our panel discussion. We have here, we have 4 panelists here tonight who are going to discuss our topic. Interpersonal violence affects us all. I've had people ask me, so why interpersonal violence and not domestic violence? And one of my daughters said, you're going to need to explain that to people. so interpersonal violence is a broader umbrella term that refers to violence or abuse between people who may or may not know each other. So that includes more types of violence against others. So our 4 panelists will each have 10 to 15 minutes to address this topic. They may ask each other during the presentations questions if they would like to. At the conclusion of the panel discussion, we will take questions from the audience, both live and on Zoom. So I really want to thank those of you who made it here in person tonight and through the snowstorm. And we will have participants on Zoom. A lot of people staying warm and safe in their homes. So, Erin, would you like to go first? Are you ready? Do you want to?
I can be ready.
You're ready. Okay. So I'm going to introduce them. Our Erin is this is Erin. I changed.
Erin is right here.
She's right here. I changed the order of this a little bit because Erin has to leave early tonight because she has an important meeting at the legislature.
Do not read all that. That's too way too much.
Okay, I won't read it. She said not to read all of her bio. So, she has 25 years of experience as a collaborative leader, a practitioner and policy analyst in domestic and sexual violence issues, criminal and juvenile justice reform, and economic opportunities for women and families. This includes overseeing legislative analysis and strategy in multiple states as the Crime and Justice Institute, and developing and leading the first statewide program focused on Utah women and families. She's the director of the public policy at the YWCA Utah. I will turn the time over to Erin.
Thank you. There we go. Now it's on.
Thanks for having me. Sorry, I'm running in at the end and also leaving early. That's polite of me. It's as you heard, my job is in public policy, so the legislative session is a tricky time of year. And actually my current role, I was the policy director at YWCA Utah, but now I'm with the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition. So obviously very relevant to these issues that we're here to talk about tonight. And my comments will focus more specifically on kind of what we think of as domestic violence or intimate partner violence. So between people who are or have been in some kind of a relationship in that way. And I was supposed to go last, which I think would make a lot more sense in our order of information to be presented. So I'm so sorry about that. I'm kind of going to skip over the really good information you're going to get about the issue itself, red flags, how do we know what to do when we are noticing this in others' lives or in our own lives, and much more that other folks will present. But I just was asked to give you a little bit of an overview of what's happening around these issues with our legislature and with our policymakers. So our role at the Utah Domestic Violence Coalition, or UDVC, is on the statewide level. So all of the domestic violence shelters and other service providers, including organizations that are all represented here, are members of our coalition, and we provide training, we provide technical assistance to them on tricky cases. And then a big piece of what we do, which is my role, is to represent service providers' voices and voices of survivors of domestic violence in those policy decisions with the legislature. We do a little bit on the federal level. We have folks who represent us at the federal level, and we definitely go and meet with Utah's delegation regularly and try to impact some of those issues. And if there were 8 more of me, I think we would do a lot more on the county and city level of government as well. But right now, the comments I'm going to make are really about at that state legislative level. And so my job is to really help facilitate that relationship and that information sharing between a legislator, and the domestic violence service provider in their area, as well as survivors and other impacted families and community members themselves. So throughout the year, we are going across the state, inviting legislators, for example, to come tour the closest shelter or service provider in their area. Just that can be really effective in helping them understand these issues. These aren't generally places that they know where they are, know what they do, understand what huge areas they're serving. And then bringing those same service providers up to the legislature and up to the Capitol as well. So during the legislative session, which is happening right now, as well as other times of the year, and then really helping people who are impacted by domestic violence or just care about it connect with legislators directly. Our legislators say that what they care about is data-driven policy decisions, and I think that's true depending on the issue to some extent, including with domestic violence. But what really makes an impact is us being able to share real people's stories and experiences with them. And one message that I really want to get across that I'm often telling people, and I don't think anyone ever believes me, but I promise it's the truth, that it really does make a difference to reach out to legislators. You often don't hear back. You may get kind of an auto response. But something that I tell survivors of domestic violence, as well as those who are helping them, is if they don't hear from you, they definitely don't have a chance to learn. And so I can't tell you the number of times that a legislator has come up to me and said, I think a constituent reached out to me about this bill. Do you know who this is? Do you know what bill they're talking about? Even if they're not quite emailing me about the right one. Their story was horrific. I really want to help with this issue. Or I've heard from my constituents that they know someone who called the hotline in Richfield, for example, and it made a huge difference for them. And they really want me to know that that's something we should be supporting at the legislature, because we do depend on some state government funding. So I really just want everyone in the state to know that if all of our voices were heard more loudly, I think it really does make a difference, even though it doesn't always feel that way. There are 16 licensed domestic violence shelters across the state, so not even one per county. We have some programs that are serving 5 counties, many, many, many thousands of square miles. They're driving 2 hours perhaps to pick up someone who maybe needs to go to the hospital, or have some kind of a specific evidence collection or healthcare exam done, or just to interview them, to talk to them, to help get some safety plans or case management up and going. So in Salt Lake County, we're really lucky to have 2 amazing programs, one of whom you will hear from tonight in terms of the what we call community-based domestic violence programs. So those are the folks doing 24/7, 365 shelter services, but also a million other services that they're providing, because the majority of domestic violence victims don't need a shelter. They need a whole lot of other services, but these organizations like the YWCA are here for both of those. And then there's so many other service providers, like the other 2 folks you'll hear from tonight, who aren't necessarily in those 16 organizations, but are doing amazing work in legal services, in community-specific services, who are advocates within police departments, whatever that looks like. There's a lot of different ways that can look. And our job is to kind of bring all of their feedback and input together so that legislators really know what this looks like on the ground. I will say, in terms of kind of the tenor of things with our legislature right now, I've been doing this for 10 years in Utah, and I would say that I have seen a big improvement and increase in understanding of how common domestic violence is. That 1 in 3 people will be impacted by this in their lifetime directly. I would argue it's probably 1 in 3 in 3, 100% of people who've been impacted in. I'm like trying to think of what that would be. That would be impacted in some way, but directly impacted is 1 in 3. So it's a lot of people. And I don't think legislators 10 years ago, when I started doing this work in Utah, understood that. I think they still felt like this doesn't happen here. And I'm not saying there isn't still some of that, obviously, but I think there is a real understanding that this happens and that it's more common than they know. And just because they can't see it doesn't mean it's not happening. So I think that's a real improvement. Unfortunately, some of the reasons they now understand that is because of some horrific homicides that we've had in the state, that kind of they can't ignore it. It's in front of their faces, and it's really impactful to people. And so I think that is an improvement. I think where we still struggle is really helping legislators understand the different ways that that can look in people's lives. So I think there's still this stereotype of somebody is punched and they have a black eye or a broken bone, and they go to the hospital and they talk to someone and they cry and they say, I need help, and they escape, and it's a big secret, and they only have the shirt on their back, and all of the kind of things you think of with like a, I don't know, Lifetime movie or something. Does that even exist anymore? Lifetime, whatever that looks like. And I think that, of course, happens in that way. But one of the things we're always trying to get legislators to understand, and working on bills right now about this, especially when it comes to divorce and custody, so many more domestic violence victims have to go through that system of the legal system, divorce and custody, than ever go through the criminal legal system. And what those judges and also legislators don't always understand is that just because you can't see bruises, just because that person didn't call the police 14 times and didn't run away in the middle of the night, doesn't mean there wasn't real violence and abuse happening. We are working on a bill this year. If you want to reach out to your House of Representative member and ask them to vote yes on HB 303, I wouldn't be sad about it. It's probably going to be voted on tomorrow. That's continuing to try to make reforms in our court systems to help them understand what we're calling coercive control. That's a really common term being used now to help them see that this isn't about individual physical violence incidents. It's about a pattern of behavior where one person controls and inflicts fear and on another person. And it's usually over time, and it's usually not just the adult survivor, but also the children in the home. And we've got to do a better job in our court systems and across our decision-making bodies to understand that that's really the problem. It's not about the individual incidents of violence. Of course, those are terrible, but if we could better identify and intervene much earlier in a coercively controlling situation, we would, I think, much more often avoid those horrific violent incidents that we hear about on the news. And yet we see story after story after story of people saying to someone in authority, this is happening to me. And that person saying, where's the bruises? Where's your police reports? Where's your visits to your doctor about this? This seems like maybe you're just not wanting your ex to have custody of the children, as an example in these situations. So I think that's our next challenge. And I could talk about a bazillion different bills, maybe not a bazillion. We are tracking over 140 this session that have some impact on domestic violence, which is a lot. If you go to our website, UDVC.org, you can look at what those are. You can see what we support, what we oppose, and how you can get involved. But I will just say there are a lot that impact domestic violence, which I will not talk about, and just say generally, I think that is the next frontier, so to speak, that we are really trying to chip away at, is helping decision makers, courts, law enforcement, other systems that deal with families in these situations, helping them understand these larger patterns that they're seeing and to intervene much more effectively before it gets to a really serious physical incident. Can I take 2 more minutes? Okay, really quick. The other thing I will say that I think is not always commonly known is the ridiculous level of lack of public funding that exists out there to support domestic violence services, which you'll probably hear about from these other folks tonight too. That's something that we are fighting for every year up at the legislature, is more funding. And there is a real hesitancy to have too many nonprofits be dependent on government funding. And I understand that's a philosophical stance. That's where a lot of people on our political spectrum stand. But I think what I wish they would understand is that the state in our law is mandated to make sure that there are domestic violence services available for victims and their families. And they have chosen in this state, and I think this is the right choice to make, to outsource that to nonprofit organizations. Then you got to put your money where your mouth is and fund those organizations to do their work. And I think that's where we still fall short in Utah. We've made huge gains and investments in the past 3 years on this. But for example, we are fighting tooth and nail this session to get a very small amount of money so that when someone is strangled by their partner and gets sent to the hospital, they don't get billed for the exam that they get. And because insurance will not cover parts of a strangulation exam because it's about collecting evidence. You would never expect to get billed for the police to come to your home after you've been broken into, for them to do their job and collect their evidence. And that's what's happening in these cases, is people are getting billed or nonprofits are trying to figure out how to make up the difference. We did not get funding from the state last year. We literally had to fundraise from private foundations and individuals like you all to say, please give us funding so we can make sure that the next person who is strangled by someone in their home, which is very high indicator that homicide could happen soon, gets the help and the evidence collection that they need to hold their perpetrator of violence accountable. And I think that's something that I'm screaming from rooftops as often as I can, is that would be unacceptable in other types of crime. And yet we still don't have the mechanisms and the funding streams and the stable state budget to say, of course, we will make sure people get this service and that we will pay for it. I think that's the least we can do for survivors. And that's just one of many examples I could give of the many ways that funding falls short for the services you're going to hear about tonight. And if I were to pick one thing for you to call all of your state legislators about, it would be to emphasize to them that whatever you think the role of government should be in our society, at the very least, it should be protecting those who are the most vulnerable among us. And that includes crime victims, and they're the least funded services in our state budget. And that needs to change if we're truly living up to what we say in the state of Utah, being family friendly and a safe state that people can thrive in. So that's my ending little soapbox. Sorry, I talk so much.
Thank you. So I'm going to go a little bit against protocol here because you're leaving.
Not yet.
Not yet. But maybe just if there are some questions just for Erin, so that we can ask her a question before she has to leave. And yes, if you're gonna ask a question in the audience, live audience, go to the microphone. And
So
if you're on Zoom, please send a chat And we'll read your question.
Linda Sage, League of Women Voters. Thank you all for coming. What's working here in Salt Lake to prevent violence before it starts? That's a huge question, I know. And what can the rest of us in the community do to be part of the solution?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. And I
It
think
looks like you all want to answer that.
yeah, I
so.
think you'll hear about some of this as people talk, but I'll just say real quick in case I have to leave before we get this far is I think that's the prevention of this before it starts is a huge lack of attention that we have in the policy realm. We're still constantly battling to just keep any kind of health education around healthy relationships in our schools. Which I think is a really important part of the answer to that question, and that a lot of organizations, these shelter organizations that do a lot more than just shelter, they go into schools and they have conversations. They try to break that intergenerational cycle of violence, but they just keep having barriers put up in front of them to say that this is not appropriate to teach our children, no matter how many times we show them that this is age appropriate curriculum. Parents can opt out, all of the things that we reassure folks of. These organizations are working really hard with their school districts, but we still come across these barriers at the state level. And so I think communicating to your legislators that you see that we just keep putting Band-Aids on these issues and we need better education and we need better early intervention for families where we know violence is happening. But it is a huge area where you could look at our 140 bills and see like 2 that are about that issue, about preventing violence before it starts. Because we're so busy putting out the fires, I think we haven't gone upstream enough. But these lovely people will say many more important things about that.
Okay, and are there any questions on Zoom, Lee? Okay, we have one more question in the audience here.
Hi, Deborah Dilly, League of Women Voters. Erin, you spoke a little bit about kind of asking for funding from the state legislature, but I was wondering if you could kind of just very briefly, because I know this is a huge, huge deep topic, talk about the funding that currently is available, such as like the Crime Victims Fund, and a little bit about how that works. Because I think, saying we need more funding, I mean, I know where it comes from because I've worked in this field, but I don't think the average person kind of knows what exactly is available for funding, what has been available, and how that works.
Yeah, so that is a big, complicated question that changes based on what kinds of crime victim services we're talking about. When it comes to domestic violence, and I can't even answer it for all of the law enforcement-based victim advocates, but at least for the 16 shelters across the state, it's about 15% of their budgets are coming from state government. But it has improved, like I said, from even 3 years ago, it was about $6 million a year that was split across those 16 organizations to now about 12, 13, I think is where they're at, because there have been such big efforts around that. And it is so expensive to run a 24/7, 365 residential facility. So that has improved over time. That is straight your tax dollars that are coming to these services. But they have to apply, they have to stay licensed with the Department of Health and Human Services. They have to apply for that funding, even if they have an amazing record and they're licensed and everything's going great. They still have to apply for grants every single year, meet particular outcomes, prove that they've spent the money as intended. So there's pretty good safeguards around that. And then there is funding from the federal government that comes down to the state level. That again goes to some of the organizations that you'll hear more from in our Victims of Crime Act funding. That does keep decreasing at the federal level. And so that's another source that goes to all different kinds of victim services. And then, like you mentioned, there's the Crime Victim Reparations Fund, which is a fund that a victim of crime can apply to for certain costs associated with their victimization. For example, mental health therapy, they can apply to get some reimbursement from that. But again, that fund desperately needs more in it. And I think probably other folks can speak to that better, because most of the folks that I've worked with in my career didn't ever report to law enforcement or go through that process. And therefore they're not even eligible for that reimbursement funding. But those are some examples of the funding.
Okay. Thank you, Erin. Jody, I'm going to read your bio first. These bios are really long and amazing. So this is Jody Peterson. She began in 2003 volunteering with a local domestic violence shelter, helping survivors obtain protective orders against their abusers. Since then, I'll go fast. She's worked at the West Valley Prosecutor's Office as their court advocate. She served on the Salt Lake County Sexual Assault Team. She was the first victim advocate at the University of Utah. She was an advocate for the Salt Lake City Police Department's mobile crisis response team, where she responded with law enforcement to prevent crisis intervention to people, and served as the sexual assault services coordinator for Peace House in Park City. Most recently, she's been the assistant program coordinator for the West Jordan City's Prosecutors Victim Assistance Program. So, Jody.
Hi. Yes, in addition to what has been said in my bio, I also worked for 4 years for the Utah Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And since these other ladies will be talking a lot about the domestic violence perspective, I decided I would take on the sexual violence aspect of this conversation. So when I was teaching around the state about sexual violence, we really could never come to an agreed upon definition of what sexual violence was. About the only thing that we could agree on about sexual violence was that it's bad. So, so sexual violence is kind of the umbrella term that encompasses everything to do with rape, sexual harassment, and things of that nature. But rape is, these are not legal definitions, but rape is a completed or attempted unwanted vaginal, oral, or anal penetration through force, threats of force, or incapacitation. Being made to penetrate someone else is also considered rape as well. And that can be a completed or attempted force penetration of another person. There's also sexual coercion, where that is unwanted sexual penetration after being pressured in a non-physical way by begging, sulking, threats to end the relationship, threats to cheat, to go find it somewhere else, things of that nature. There's unwanted sexual contact. So that's the intentional touching of somebody's body when they don't want you to, especially in their no-no square, the bikini area, if you will. And then there's also non-contact unwanted sexual experiences. So exposure to sexual content without consent, exhibitionism, voyeurism, sexual harassment, threats of sexual violence, and unwanted sexting, etc. So when we define what sexual violence is, I think it's also important that we're talking about what does consent mean. So consent is something that is freely and actively given without threat, force, or coercion. And this is all the time, every time. So you need to be making sure that your partner is on board for what is happening enthusiastically, and also knowing that just because you've had sexual access to this person's body one time does not mean it's carte blanche from that point forward, and that you get to have access to that person's body whenever you want to. And then consent is also something that is ongoing and can be withdrawn at any time. Maybe somebody is down for certain sexual acts, but they're not to go past third base or things of that nature. It can also be during a sexual encounter. Like, you need to make sure that your partner is on board for, if you're deciding that you're going to have sex in this one way, but you're like, oh, I saw this really cool thing on TV, I think I want to give this a try. You have to okay that with your partner. And that's a conversation you should be having with your partner before this encounter is happening. During sex, not a good time. So what sexual or what consent is not is it it doesn't have to be a direct no. People can tell you no in a multitude of ways. It can be, no, I'm sorry, I have a partner, I'm in a relationship. I'm sorry, honey, I have a headache tonight. And it can also be through their conduct. You know, if they're not also actually engaging in what's happening and they're not seeming to be happy about what's happening, they're probably not on board for it. Also, if a person is threatened directly or indirectly, physically or emotionally, that is not consent. You may have wore them down. You may have hit a trigger for them that causes them to, I'm going to do the air quotes, consent, but really they haven't consented when you threaten to kill their dog. Victims also who are unconscious, asleep, or unaware of the act that is occurring are not able to consent. Also, somebody who is physically unable to resist because of, they could potentially have an injury or things of that nature. And then also the victim is knowingly or unknowingly administered a substance that impairs their ability to give, deny, or revoke consent. So this can be somebody willingly taking some sort of a substance or somebody whose drink was spiked or things of that nature. Some statistics that I'd like to run by you all are and I'm sorry, this is not extensive by any means. We do have a very short period of time in which to tell you about all of these things, so it's not super inclusive. But nationally, 43.6% of women report experiencing sexual assault in their lifetime. 21.3% experience an attempted or completed rape in their lifetime. Of men who were polled, 24.8% reported experienced sexual assault, and 1.9% reported experience a completed or attempted rape. So, one thing that you would be interested to know is that in Utah, in this community that we consider to be a very safe place and a very good place to raise children, we are above the national averages for people being sexually assaulted and raped. One of the number one misconceptions that we have about rape is that rape only happens to women and that it only happens by men who are strangers that are lurking in dark alleys and wielding a weapon. And that's not the truth. According to the CDC, less than 17% of rapes or attempted rapes are perpetrated by strangers. This means that we know or are acquainted to at least 83% of rape assailants. According to the FBI, the FBI's Uniform Crime Report, the yearly average of unfounded or false rape reports are between 5 to 5.5%. So that's one of the big misconceptions that we have, is that people make up rape. They're doing it to get attention. They're doing it because they feel guilty about having sex. Several reasons why we believe that victims lie about this. The FBI, that big feminist group, they're telling us otherwise. So there is a very small percentage of rapes that are actually founded to be a false report. Also, we need to stop with the victim blaming. Victim blaming has a very chilling effect on a victim's willingness to come forward. They're often so afraid to come forward that they feel that they won't be believed. And I like to use the example of Elizabeth Smart in this, because I cannot think of a better example of the innocent victim, the person that did absolutely nothing to contribute to their crime. But even Elizabeth Smart was not necessarily outright disbelieved, but she talked in the most recent Netflix series that she did, talked about how people were questioning why she didn't try to escape harder. So we really, of all victims of violent crime, we really hold victims of sexual violence to a level of accountability that is superhuman. It's not even possible. So let's see. So I also wanted to talk, since we are talking about intimate partner violence and we are talking a lot about domestic violence, I want to talk about the intersectionality of sexual violence. 51.1% of intimate partner violence survivors report experiencing sexual violence in their intimate partner violence relationship or with a dating partner. That's a really high statistic, right? 51.1%. Anecdotally, as a victim advocate and a case manager working with sexual assault survivors, I would say that is a very low statistic. Almost all of my clients reported some form of sexual violence in an abusive relationship. So how am I doing on time?
I've got 5 minutes.
Okay. Okay. So one thing that I also want to include with when we talk about that intersectionality of sexual violence happening within the context of a committed relationship is that victims in that context experience post-traumatic stress disorder on a level that somebody who was raped one time doesn't experience. They are raped in their home, which should be the safest place in the world for them, and they are raped by the person who has pledged to be their protector. There's also kind of an escalation thing that happens when you are a person who rapes other people and you have unlimited access to somebody to exert that kind of control and power over. The sexual assaults tend to get more what's the word I'm looking for? Like more humiliating, more violent, more frequent. It's kind of like they have to keep on upping that level to get that same level of that same rush. And also rape within intimate partner relationships is one of the few times that we ever encourage a rape survivor to stay with their rapist. But for marital reasons, for children in common, for religious reasons, things like that, we are continually reinforcing the idea that rape survivors should just be more sexually available to their perpetrator. There's also reproductive coercion and sabotage. So we know that more children in intimate partner, the more children that a victim of intimate partner violence has, the harder it is for them to extract themselves from that relationship. Abusers know this too. And so they will sabotage their birth control efforts. So they'll destroy or throw away their pills. They'll put holes in condoms. They'll accuse them of cheating if they want to use any kind of protection. There's also pregnancy coercion where they're forcing them into pregnancy or forcing them to have an abortion. And then there are other instances of people lying about their fertility or that they've had a vasectomy when they really haven't. Okay. So as the Utah League of Women Voters, I am kind of anticipating that the question that we would all receive is, how can we help? So
she's right.
So how we can help in our community is that we can push for increased funding. You'll probably hear that over and over again. Let's go for legislative advocacy. Utah's rape crisis centers are chronically underfunded and understaffed. This results in really long wait times for survivors to have to wait for services. And then rape crisis centers, as well as domestic violence facilities, are often reliant on grants. And so I want to highlight that one of the main grants that we go for is the VOCA grant. The VOCA grant since 2016 has declined 60%. So in the past year, our grant, that one of our main grants that we've used, has declined down to 60%. We're expected to do less or more with less. And then we have a federal funding freeze in January 2025. This was pretty catastrophic for a lot of rape crisis centers. They had to do hiring freezes. Some had to, this is nationally, some had to lay people off. Some people had to stop staffing a 24-hour crisis line and just doing it during business hours. There was a lot of fallout that happened from this. And then especially anybody who ran that intersectionality of assisting domestic violence and intimate partner violence victims and sexual violence victims who were specifically, the grants were specifically written for people of color, for LGBTQ, pretty much like any DEI wording in grants were gone. And some pretty incredible advocates have been unemployed since our grant cycle ended in July. So advocate for specific state funding that is allocated for rape crisis centers. We need money to pay for therapists who are specifically trained in how to work with sexual assault survivors, because I don't care if you go on psychology.com and the therapist tells you that they have experience working with trauma survivors. They will put that on their bio if they have been to one conference. One conference does not an expert make. It is something that you have to do a lot, and you have to do it continually. So I would appreciate it if we would mandate that people have to recertify in order to continue working in the setting of working with sexual assault survivors. This also includes anybody in the criminal justice system. I don't know what this looks like today, but about 10 years ago when I was working as an advocate, one of my favorite detectives in the Special Victims Unit had never once taken any kind of training that had to do with sexual violence. And this is why so many rape victims who have reported will report back to victim advocates and other people that they felt like the system raped them again. And we think about it as the nasty defense attorney who gets up there and asks what they're what they were wearing, were they drinking, like what their activity was. We aren't even getting victims that far. There's such a very small percentage of victims who make it that far. We're losing them in emergency rooms because they're not treated well by ER staff. We're losing them at patrol officers who come to take an initial report. We owe it to not only victims, but the people who are serving victims to give them this training. It is an absolute disservice to law enforcement, to judges, to victim advocates, to anybody who is working in this field who is not receiving regular training. And with that, see.
Hey. Good time. Thank you, Jody.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm gonna, Heidi, are you? Sure. You ready? Okay. This is Heidi Nestel. She's currently the project director and staff attorney for the Utah Crimes Victims Legal Clinic, which provides free legal representation to victims of crime as they go through the criminal justice system. Prior to starting the legal clinic, Heidi was a prosecutor for the Davis County Attorney's Office and a victim service director. She specializes in prosecuting violent crimes against women, including domestic violence, assault, violence of protective orders, rape, and sexual assault, and prosecutes in the juvenile court system, right? Okay. She Heidi has a summa cum laude graduate, undergraduate degree in political science from the University of Utah. She received the Harry Truman Scholarship based on her dedication to working with juveniles and minor victims in the public sector. She also holds a master's and JD degree from the University of Utah. So, Heidi.
Thank you. It is such with all of you and with this distinguished panel. I'm thrilled to see my mentor and Professor Smith here, who really helped me launch my legal career and was on the board when the legal clinic started 20 years ago. So today, my kind of insight is to talk about the court system, not just the criminal, but the civil court system, and how victim survivors work within that system, how they're treated, what rights they have, and hopefully inspire a discussion with all of you to see how we can improve the system for crime victim survivors. So I do use the word victim because it's a term of art. Victims in Utah do have rights, and they're called crime victims' rights. So if I say that, please know that I very much am honored to work with the survivors that go through the system. I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Utah Crime Victims Legal Clinic because it is a really unique resource and service here in Utah. Utah was one of 8 states in the nation in 2005 that were chosen to start a legal clinic to see if it would make a difference and what it would look like if victims had their own attorneys. So in the criminal justice system for over 200 years, since the United States have had a criminal justice system, we have prosecutors who represent the state, represent the community to hold people accountable for crimes. But prosecutors are not victims' attorneys. They represent the public at whole. And then defendants who go through the system are entitled to have an attorney, oftentimes being appointed a public defender. So in the state of Utah, we have hundreds of skilled and talented prosecutors. We have hundreds of public defenders available to help defendants get through the process and assert their rights. But there's never really been a role for victims in the system until the mid-1990s in Utah, when victims were given rights through the legislature and through a constitutional amendment and through statute. And they haven't had their own advocate in the court system. And so Utah was one of the 8 original states chosen to start this model. It was just supposed to be a 3-year pilot project. But our services were valued and we were able to make some inroads. And now we've been here for 20 years representing crime victims. But compared to the hundreds of attorneys available to defense attorneys, there are 4 attorneys in the state of Utah through my office that provide free legal services to crime victims. So we'll just talk a little bit about those services and then how victims actually interact with the court system. And also some legislative priorities, because I know this group is so effective. So we are a nonprofit. We do get our funding primarily through federal grants, but also some state funding. In the last 3 years, we get $75,000 from the state. We serve victims statewide. So there are 29 counties, 8 judicial districts. And in the 20 years that we've been operating, we have helped victims in every county in Utah. So I'm very proud of that. We serve victims of all types of crimes, but the primary client that we have are victims of interpersonal violence. So domestic violence, sexual violence, homicide survivors, typically in domestic violence cases, child abuse victims, human trafficking victims. So very serious crimes that have complicated issues and trauma-related problems. Another purpose of the Utah Crime Victims Legal Clinic is to provide education and training. So because we can't be involved in every case in the state of Utah, we've developed a mission that we want to train and inspire criminal justice professionals and victim advocates to understand victims' rights and to assert those rights when appropriate. So that's another purpose of the legal clinic. Why does legal representation matter? How does it help a victim get through this very complicated and oftentimes overwhelming process? Well, the good news is that victims in Utah do have rights. And even though Utah was not the first state to pass a Bill of Rights for victims, Wisconsin was in the early 1980s. Utah quickly came on board, and by 1995, we had passed a constitutional amendment, Article 1, Section 28, and a host of victims' rights statutes and Supreme Court rules to help protect and recognize that victims are an important part of our court process. So that is the good news. Even though we've had rights for over 30 years now, I will report that we're still the criminal justice system. Defendants have had rights in our system for over 250 years, and their rights are anchored in the federal Constitution, which, if you know anything about the hierarchy of laws, if the defendant has a right in the federal Constitution, a victim has a right in state law, and they conflict with each other, who's going to win? Typically the defendant's rights. But my staff and I were passionate about going to court and advocating for victims' rights and finding a place for them as well. Rights only have meaning if they're known about, if they're asserted, and if they're enforced. So having legal representation and having victim advocates assisting victims through this process, and talented and passionate prosecutors are what helps victims' rights have meaning, to actually bring up the victim's desires and their interests to the court, so that decision makers like prosecutors, law enforcement officers, and judges can consider the interests and desires of the victims when they make important decisions in court cases. Again, prosecutors don't represent the victim. A lot of victims feel, oh, the prosecutor's my attorney. But the prosecutor has to weigh the interest of justice in general, defendants' rights, what is best for resolving a case. And sometimes, even though that's often aligned with what victims want, sometimes it's different, or victims might have additional interests like protecting their privacy that a prosecutor may not necessarily have on their radar. And then we also want to have victims have rights and participate in the system so that they are empowered and that they feel like they have an independent voice and have some sort of persuasion in the system. So I've talked about these rights. I just want to quickly talk about some of the core rights that victims have so that you have kind of an understanding of what's important and how victims can participate. Privacy rights, especially in interpersonal relationship crimes and harms, are so important. Especially when you think of interpersonal, that typically means that the perpetrator knows the victim really well. They have intertwined their lives, they have a relationship, so that perpetrator knows how to harm the victim, knows what is important to them, knows their history, knows that the victim survivor's history. And so protecting a victim's privacy, whether it be their medical records, therapy records, their digital or social media footprint, those have all become emerging issues that are really important to victims that we fight for every day in court. One way that defendants either harass or engage victims in the process is by subpoenaing victims, either to come to court to testify, which can be a traumatic experience to have to relive the crime, especially in the same room as their abuser or their perpetrator, and also just bringing up a lot of emotions and trauma. Subpoenas to have to turn over information. So again, the privacy issue. So one important reason to have rights and legal representation in the court system is to make sure that if victims are being asked to engage, that they have input and they have the ability to say, no, I don't want to turn that over. That's too much of an invasion. I don't want to come and testify unless I have to. And there are some hearings like trials where victims do have to testify because defendants have a constitutional right to confront their accuser. But we try to do everything we can to protect victims up to that point to make sure that it is a safe and fair process. Victims do have a right to be present and heard in court. Before the 1990s in Utah, if victims even found out when a court case was going to be heard, they would show up. There would be no particular place where they could sit, no opportunities for them to talk to the court and let the judges know what they want. Well, that has changed. In Utah's Constitution, victims do have a right to come to court, to stay in during the hearings and to be heard on specific and important issues. So that's an opportunity for people working with crime victims, either advocates or attorneys, to make sure that victims know they have that right and be prepared to help them be heard at important stages. Another important step to help victims of interpersonal violence is to make sure that they have protection, not just their privacy, but their personal safety. So one thing that the Utah Crime Victims Legal Clinic does, Utah Legal Aid, Utah Legal Services, we work very hard to make sure that victims can get protective orders, either in the civil court process or through the criminal court if a criminal case has been filed. We help victims seek restitution. So unfortunately, an outcome of a lot of crime is the financial burden on the victim, whether they've had to move for safety and install a security system, seek therapy or medical assistance. All of that costs money. And that harm was inflicted on them by their abuser. So we want to help victims recover that and hold the offender accountable for the financial costs of the crime. So we help victims seek restitution. And then a really important concept, and it's actually the first right listed in our state constitution, is the victim's right to fairness, dignity, respect, and to be free from abuse. So keep those things in mind. What would fairness mean to you as you're going through the system? How important is being treated with dignity to someone who has been harmed, abused, traumatized? It's very important. And so when I go and train police officers or prosecutors, even judges, just returning phone calls, giving victims an opportunity to speak and tell their story. Those are signs of respect and dignity. Making sure that they feel safe in court and they're not being harassed by either the defendant or the defendant's support system is really important. So those are the rights, those are the core rights that victims have in Utah and battles that we fight every day for them. Why legal rights matter is a justice system that ignores victims erodes public trust. Our criminal justice system, although not every crime is labeled a victim crime, the majority of crimes that go through our system do involve not only primary victims, but their family members, friends, and support system as secondary victims. So this impacts a lot of people. When victims feel disenfranchised or don't feel included in the system, that can really weaken their resolve to follow through, to cooperate. And so we need to make sure, and then we can't hold offenders accountable. So we need to make sure it's an inclusive process. Now, were you just saying I have 1 minute? Okay, a couple of minutes. Maybe I should move on from just victims' rights. So just common challenges I want you to be aware of when victims go through the court system is they do often feel a privacy violation. They feel silenced or that they're in the dark because they don't know what's happening or when it's going to happen. They're called on to give a duplicative or unnecessary testimony. So again, limiting how many times a victim needs to testify is really important. They experience fatigue in delays and just how demanding the system is, and this fact that there is typically unequal access to legal resources. So just, I had brought 2 ideas for legislative change or focus, and one has been talked about extensively, and that is sustainable state funding for victim services, especially legal services, because we do rely on VOCA and VAWA grants, but as has been mentioned, our funding has been cut more than 35% in the last 3 years, which has translated into 2 of our attorneys and advocates having been fired in the last year just because, or terminated just because we couldn't fund them anymore, even though we continue to have the need and, people want our services, and it's very difficult to say we've reached capacity. That is like a painful message for us to deliver. Other protections, if I had a wand, even more than funding my program, if I had a wand and could do one thing for victims, it would be for laws to better protect victim privacy. One absolute attack and assault in the last couple of years has been on victims' digital privacy. Right now, we do not have protections for victims' cell phones. So if they're a victim of a crime, the defendant can ask for a whole cell phone download. The victim has to turn over their phone, relinquish it, sometimes for days, and then all of their information is downloaded and sifted through, oftentimes either by the court. We always ask for a judge's review first, but oftentimes by defense counsel and defendants. And so you can imagine what an invasive process that is. And we've been trying to get some protections. We have pretty good protections for therapy and medical records, but really no protections for cell phones, journals, financial documents. So that would be my wish list for change, to have more privacy protections for victims.
Thank you, Heidi. Okay. So Mindy Maude. Mindy is the Vice President of Domestic Violence and Residential Services at the YWCA Utah, where she oversees emergency shelter, case management, and family justice center programming. In addition to leading direct services, she's actively involved in policy development and advocacy efforts that strengthen organizational and community responses to domestic violence. She also serves as the co-chair of the Crisis Response Core Function Group for the Salt Lake Valley Coalition to End Homelessness, helping advance coordinated system-level solutions. Okay. Thank you, Mindy.
Hey, hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here. It's so nice to be here with these incredible women. My name is Mindy Maude, as they said. I'm the Vice President of Domestic Violence and Residential Services at the YWCA, which is a domestic violence shelter. A little bit about my background. I started out in homeless services with Volunteers of America, where I worked there 6 years in homeless outreach. And after I graduated, I still wanted to work with vulnerable populations, but I wanted to broaden my scope, and domestic violence is exactly that. Because domestic violence does not discriminate. I can work with the unsheltered, with substance abuse, with my neighbor in Utah County, with everybody. It does not discriminate. And that's really what pulled me in. And I've been with YWCA now for about 5 years. Some quick numbers. People have been talking about them, but I think it's good to put them up. 1 in 3 women in Utah and 1 in 5 men in Utah have experienced domestic violence. Now, I say these statistics a lot. I say these numbers quite a bit, and they start becoming less, I think, impactful to me the more that I say them. What really conceptualizes it for me is in any conversation I have when I'm with someone and I tell them what I do, immediately they themselves or someone that is one step removed has experienced some type of domestic violence. It is a cousin, it is a friend, it is themselves, it's a dad, it's a brother. It is so prevalent in Utah. And as it's already been spoke to, it's higher than the national average considerably. Just in 2023, there were over 13,000 incidents of domestic violence. And one of the more concerning numbers, obviously all very concerning, is that domestic and familial violence accounts for 37% of homicides in Utah. We are very high in homicides. And that's something I'll touch on a little bit further down. So I want to talk a little bit about what I do and what my organization does when it comes to domestic violence. I've really appreciated hearing both of the insights. Mine is a little bit more direct services for if someone is trying to leave their abuser. And we'll touch on it, but it's very hard to do, very hard to do. So we are one of the 16 domestic violence shelters in Utah. We are the largest. We are downtown 3rd and 3rd. And it's a big block, hard to miss, and a little bit hard to miss, which I think is the point. The first thing that we have is our Family Justice Center, which is our walk-in facility. So when survivors are thinking of leaving, the statistic is it takes up to 7 acts of abuse violence for them to leave. Usually about 7 is the number. And that's a very hard decision to make. There's a lot of barriers, kids, family, financial, whatever it might be. So we have a walk-in facility called the Family Justice Center. And a lot of the people that come there are just wanting to know what is available to them. How would I get my own ID? What would rental assistance look like? How do I get a protective order? And they can come there and they can just ask those questions without any type of commitment. One thing we see a lot is as a survivor moves through our system, maybe someone is wanting to leave their abusive partner. They go maybe to get an ID, they wait a couple hours, they found a window that was safe, they hope they didn't see anyone, they get all the way to the front and they're in the wrong building, they're in the wrong line, and they just get sent around the system. Our system is not set up to support survivors or to help them. It really deters them in most instances because there's so many barriers to get to what they need. The Family Justice Center is kind of to negate that. It's a one-stop shop. So they can come, they could talk to immigration services, they could get a hold of rape recovery, they could talk to one of our victim advocates, they could get a sexual assault examination, they could talk about, they could get housing. It's really so that they can go to one place, and that really depends on our partnerships in the community. We have a lot of co-located services at our Family Justice Center. The next step for a survivor generally after the Family Justice Center, and this is our services, but it does kind of speak to a journey that a survivor might go on, is our emergency shelter. So we have a 24-hour crisis line, 7 days a week, every single day of the year. It will always be answered. On average, we get about 100 calls a week, and depending on holidays, because that kind of changes, people wait after holidays, summer seasons, there's a lot of statistics around when people are willing to leave or able to leave. We can get up to 500 calls a week on that line. It is constantly ringing, and many of those are seeking emergency shelter. Even us being the largest there, just in Utah will never be enough space. And partially big part of that is based on what you've heard today, which is funding. There is not enough funding to build that space, to staff that space, to feed that space, janitorial. It is a huge undertaking, and there is not enough funding for it. So then they will reach out to us for emergency shelter. It's immediate safe housing for survivors and their children that are fleeing domestic violence. We accept anyone. I know that it is maybe a generic look to be like the women and the children. We take men, non-binary individuals, anyone that is seeking shelter is open to come with us. When people come to us, when they are admitted into our emergency shelter, the first need we hear is housing. Because even if they come from a 30-year mortgage, a rental situation, or come from being unsheltered, they are rendered homeless when they come to us because they have left their situation. And I'm sure I don't have to tell people, but this housing situation we're in is not good. It's expensive, it is hard to get, and it is even harder to get if you don't have documentation, if you have any felonies, anything but any type of barrier, it then becomes insurmountable. So the average shelter stay is 30 days in most shelter. Ours is 90, just to allow enough time, because just for me to get my birth certificate shift here is 30 days, and then your stay's up, and then the only place you can go is back to your abuser, and we just will see you again in a couple of weeks probably. And so our stays are longer to try to change that statistic a little bit, so that we can stabilize them into housing. And that all is through our case management program, which also helps with all the things that you would assume, childcare, job assistance, mental health, physical health. Many come from strangulation and need some physical, some type of medical. Like it is all encompassing to the best of our abilities. But again, it is a tall order. And then lastly, on our campus, we have transitional housing. So you can kind of see it as a continuation of care of the walk-in facility, then you come into shelter. And then if you still are needing services, then we have transitional housing. It's 36 units. And it is available to anyone. Generally, it does come from shelter into transitional housing, and people can stay there for a variety of reasons. It could be because they still need that long-term case management. It could be because their abuser was not arrested and is still actively looking for them, and they need the type of security we have at our facility. Or it could just be because it's a good middle ground because housing is not affordable, and we can be more flexible with their lease. And so that is kind of the journey, if we're able to stabilize, that we work through when we have a survivor come to us. Everyone looks different. Every journey, every need looks different, but that's kind of the model and what we do at YWCA, my facility. Just a quick snapshot of our numbers. Just last year, over 4,000 crisis calls answered, 1,700 individuals served in our shelter, 1,500 individuals served through FJC, and over 10,000 nights in shelter beds. And I am just one facility. This is just one of many that are serving this population in our state. Our role in the community, when people are needing the type of help that we have, it is because they're support system looks different. So often when I talk about the numbers, people are really shocked. And I think the reason that they're shocked is because internally, and I'll speak for myself, if I was experiencing domestic violence, I'd go to my parents' house, I'd go to my neighbor's house, I'd go to my best friend's house. And so it's shocking that there's that many, but many of our survivors have had those options taken away from them. They've been isolated, their family lives out of state, they're not believed, whatever it might be. So we really are sometimes the last resort because no one wants to bring their children into a shelter, no matter what. They want them to feel safe, but they're doing this for themselves, for their family. So very important to us to have our service protect survivors' privacy, location, and ensuring that abusers cannot track them, which they are constantly being tracked. One of the biggest things that we need is how we coordinate with our community. So we partner with law enforcement, legal advocates, healthcare providers, other agencies. Today I'm going to talk I think I'm good on time. Yeah.
No, you're good.
Okay. I talked so fast. Today I want to talk about our partnership specifically with law enforcement. I know we talked a lot about legislation and how it can work. I want to talk about SB 117. This passed in 2023, and it is the lethality assessment program. So as I talked about in the beginning, and Erin touched on it a little bit, homicides very high in our states, and some pretty horrific and public in nature of how the media picked them up. So a lot of attention came to the homicides that happened in our state. And so they passed SB 117, which is the lethality assessment protocol, which means that when officers go out on a domestic violence call, that they have to do a certain assessment. So the first thing is officers respond to a DV call and complete the lethality screening. It's 11 questions. They're very straightforward. Some examples: did your partner strangle you? Does your partner own a gun? Has your partner lost their job in the last 60 days? And they just answer yes or no to determining factors. The police officer will just score it, and then without sugarcoating will tell them clearly if they are at risk of being killed by their partner, and they will say it very clearly to them. It's a missing step. So I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but when I started doing training with officers on this, anecdotally, they would tell me pretty frequently that they would get called to a call that nothing would really happen. Maybe they got called 2 hours later, and then there were some very severe injuries, or that because the initial call was not handled the way that it is now, which is that you have to take some type of action with the call. You can't just go check and be like, everyone good here, and head out. That's no longer the case. They are now mandated that they have to do the lethality assessment. But then what's the connection to us? So the high-risk survivor immediately is connected to the YWCA advocate by phone. And we're not the only ones. Every provider has a partnership. We have about 9 different police departments that we are partnered with. So on any DV call, they will go respond with a victim, and they will call us directly. Now that victim may want long-term services with us. They may want just a night so that family can come and get them. They may not. They may just want some referrals and some information, some safety planning, or they may not want to talk to us at all. All of those options are fine, but they are always given the option to do so now. The advocate provides crisis intervention and safety planning, and then we're really focused on how we can do the follow-up. This is a life-saving legislation that was passed for us. It has really changed a lot of how those calls are handled, because quite frankly, they were handled poorly, to say the least, prior to this bill. I will skip this one. It's a lot of words, which is fine. This came with challenges, however. So phase 1, the LAP brings more high-risk survivors. Phase 2, it expands eligibility. But then the combined effect of that triggered an unprecedented demand for us. We've never seen anything like it. Our calls went up by 300%. We were shocked by the amount of calls DV calls that they went out of, which might have been my ignorance to law enforcement and how often these calls were happening, but it is constant. And then it really centers us in how we want to meet that moment, because we were not given funding and very, very little funding. There were millions that were allotted when it was passed. It all went to law enforcement, and service providers got pennies on the dollar, if you will. Erin did an incredible job last legislative session of asking for a little bit more, but it's not even enough for one advocate to handle the amount of phone calls that we get, let alone like the linens, just the things that go into bringing in a family or an individual when we get those type of calls. So I bring this up just as we're talking about advocating because it makes such a difference in survivors' lives. But moving forward together, it is just about how we can advocate for survivors for the funding for the people that take care of them. Overhead, if you will, is always a thing that is forgotten. We get a good amount of like donations and things for, bedding, that type of things, but not the funding, state funding, federal funding to pay for the staff that are taking care of them, to take care of the staff that's coming, bringing the family in at 2 a.m. We're going to continue to move forward. Every decision we do prioritizes survivors' autonomy, dignity, and safety in the most trauma-informed fashion we can, knowing that we're working with survivors that have really been so brave to take this step forward. But as I hope I've kind of put out, it's a hurdle. It's very hard. I could talk about it at length of the barriers that are put in their place to be able to leave. And we really count on those community partnerships, and because we just can't do it all. And there's so many needs. So the women at this table, all the organizations are pivotal to us being able to help these survivors as they are taking that next step out of their abusive situation. Thank you for the time. I'm very appreciative of being able to talk to you guys. If you need more information, our website is always available, and then my information is there as well.
Thank you so much, Mindy. So just a couple of follow-up items. Questions. If you have a question, come to the microphone, and we have one on Zoom. Okay, Lee, you want to read it?
This is for Mindy. Does the YWCA have a protocol for dealing with potential ICE or Border Patrol attempted interventions?
Yes, it's been, I'm sure every organization, we've talked about it at length because we don't ask those types of questions. So I do not know if you are documented or undocumented. We will serve you all the same. But we do have some federal grants that prior to this administration were given to us based off being able to serve undocumented individuals. So it is documented that they are on our campus. We do constant drills. We have had people come in to do conferences for people to know their rights. Obviously, I think our biggest concern is that that the proper procedures won't be followed, that they won't come with a judicial warrant, that they will just make their way in. And then it's just about safety planning with the families, because we do have several families we do have instances where ICE would be a problem for us, but we do weekly drills, and we have for the last 3 months.
I'll ask a couple questions if I can. I want to ask a question about rape, and Heidi may know the answer to this as well as Jody. Prosecutors won't bring a case forward if they don't believe that they have that they are likely to be able to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That's just sort of their standard. And when a rape case is a he said, she said, in other words, there's no witnesses, there's not a lot of physical injuries that would be consistent with a rape, prosecutors will often decline to go forward with the case because they go, it's he said, she said. I can't say that I'm probably going to be able to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Yet, I think from what you were saying, there's social science evidence that this is likely a rape. Is there any and so these cases don't go forward. People feel like they've been mistreated by the criminal justice system because they've done everything they needed to do, and then the prosecutor says, I'm just not going to go forward with your case. Is there any movement in that area, any attempt to say, well, let's just try them and see what happens? Let's put on some social science evidence about so that the jury will understand why this victim did things that maybe seem counterintuitive, like told the story in a disordered way, or forgot some things and then remembered it afterwards, because the jury doesn't know about PTSD and trauma, and they will, the defense will say, see, this person's lying because they don't remember this, they don't remember that. But an expert witness could testify about, no, they're probably credible because somebody that suffered trauma would naturally do these things. So I'm just wondering if there's any movement afoot to push forward the possibility of trying these cases where there probably is a crime, but prosecutors are hesitant.
Go right ahead.
Thank you so much for that insightful question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Heidi, Nestel. I was a prosecutor for 8 years, so just I can just report that, you know, there is actually no written or adopted standard. It is considered a best practice that has just been now adopted as what prosecutors a self-imposed standard of they cannot file a case unless they feel there's a reasonable certainty of conviction. And the burden of proof in the criminal justice system is beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's a very high standard. I think the statistic is 1 in 10 rapes are reported and about 6% of reported are filed criminal charges. So that's a lot of sexual assault victims who never get their case filed or feel like they get to be heard in the justice system. So that is very difficult. I appreciate what you said, and I have seen since I've been working the legal system for 28 years, I would say in the last 15 years, we've become so much better at identifying those myths and complicated behaviors of sexual assault victims that can be explained through expert testimony, through insight and educating jurors. And I have seen, I think across the board throughout Utah, I've seen almost every county avail themselves of expert witnesses to take those difficult cases and to actually try them in front of a jury so they can explain victim behavior and explain the victim's perspective and trauma and how that impacts the brain and memory and ability to recount. So that has been a really important improvement. Another change that we did, because we had so many counties that were dismissing cases or never filing cases, is about 5 to 6 years ago, we passed House Bill 281. We call it the 281 Project, which essentially gives a second view at the Attorney General's office. So if a case is declined or dismissed at the county level, we can request this team at the Attorney General's office to either reinvestigate that sexual assault. It has to be a first-degree felony crime, which most sex assaults are rapes and sex crimes against children. So if those cases are declined by the county, we can ask the Attorney General's office to do more investigation and possibly even prosecute the case themselves. And there have been a couple of cases where they have done more investigation. They've found even more victims of the same perpetrator, and they've been able to go forward. So I do think it's still a battle where the statistic is, harrowing to say only 6% of reported sexual assaults are actually prosecuted. We can do a better job. I have sat around tables with prosecutors when they've been talking about these cases, and so many times I've heard them say, "We believe her." I'm just generalizing, a female victim could, "We believe her, but we don't know if a jury will." And I'm like, well, if we believe her, why wouldn't somebody else? Let's let the victim survivor give their story and let a jury decide that issue. And there isn't one prosecutor I know who has taken a case to trial where they thought they, were going to lose, and they end up, getting a conviction. Or they thought they had a slam dunk case and a jury came back and acquitted. So juries are somewhat unpredictable, but our process is to let juries decide. And so I'm an advocate for taking those difficult and complicated cases, using expert testimony, explaining victim behavior, letting victims tell their story, and letting a jury decide. So we've made some headways, but we still have more to go. Jody, do you have anything else?
I was going to say everything that you said verbatim.
Okay, well, there you go.
Very thorough. Thank you.
You had one more question, Linda?
Yeah. Now let me ask a question from slightly different perspective. I started practicing law in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts was the first state to have a protective order statute, and that was in the 70s, right? And at that time, the attitude was, you're a victim of domestic violence, you should get out of there and get divorced because it's over. Now, I didn't hear anybody here talk about the different categories of domestic violence, because the social scientists now have different categories. There's terroristic domestic violence, which is that if that's what you see, you're right. You should get out of there as fast as you can and have no contact with the person again. There's mutual combat domestic violence, which is different than, terroristic domestic violence. Both parties are beaten on each other for dysfunctional reasons. And then there are domestic violence that occurs because of an incident. Somebody's lost their job and all of a sudden they're very upset, and all of a sudden, domestic violence flares up. This isn't a constant pattern in the relationship. I think there's like 7 different categories the social scientists have come to my classes and tell me. Everything that I've heard tonight has sort of reminded me of the old mindset back in the 70s, that the only answer is escape and have nothing to do with this terrible person that has mistreated you. Talk to me about, and I've had other very few programs that deal with the individuals that have perpetrated the violence, because in a lot of instances, the victim really would like the marriage to work, and there might not be, it's not terroristic domestic violence. It's an incident that occurred because of, something bad happening in life, or, escalating interpersonal relations that could be dealt with by each party having therapy and later having marital therapy. Talk to me about what's going on in the community to treat perpetrators and when that would be an appropriate response. We didn't invite the right expert.
Just a little bit of insight that I would provide. As a prosecutor for 5 years, my assignment was domestic violence cases. In about 50% of those cases, the victim would contact me and say, I don't want this case to go forward. I'm trying to reconcile. And that could be for a number of reasons. It could be for nefarious reasons that they're being pressured or tampered with, but it could be for other reasons that they have invested in their partner. They've seen good in their partner. They feel that change can happen. I would say overall, our criminal justice system, our system is designed for rehabilitation as much or even more than punitive sanctions. So there are a lot of opportunities. I don't have, of course, I've heard of victim offender programs where they, offer counseling, domestic violence, anger management, they can try to hone in and provide specific services. I am a proponent of that. I think that oftentimes that can help, whether it's parenting classes or learning how to be a better partner. But it does take a desire. And one problem that I've seen with domestic violence abusers is lack of accountability and accepting responsibility. And that's an important part of rehabilitation. So not to be skeptical, but there are a lot of challenges.
So for me, for direct services, there is nothing available for the perpetrator. We are solely serving the survivor. I will say, however, that many do leave our shelter and return to their abuser.
Are there other programs that provide services for the perpetrator?
There are a lot of community-based services that are provided, and there are agencies who work with the courts and oftentimes will be present to represent their organization, so that as the judge is, giving sentencing to the.
That would be in the context of a criminal prosecution.
Right.
And in these cases where people might actually be able to work it out, they're probably the least likely to be in criminal prosecutions.
Yes, it's very hard to get them held accountable in the legal system, and unfortunately, we kind of look at this in a really backwards way. We are constantly saying, like, why doesn't she leave, instead of why does he keep hitting her? We're not looking at this in the right context. And what incentive does an abuser have to change? They've got a pretty sweet life. They come home and everybody walks on pins and needles trying to make them happy. Dinner served, the house is clean, the kids are quiet. Why would they change?
I see, volunteering regularly in the family law session, protective orders don't result in any sort of order like that. They're like an emergency, like, let's stop the bleeding, okay? But if the couples have children together and they file either divorce or child custody situation, then there often is a lot of court orders to the parties to go to therapy. because those parties are going to have to communicate with each other and are going to have, and now they're not trying to get the parties back together again, but they're forcing the parties to deal with one another on around the children. And so at that point, you'll get court orders that this person is going to have to go to therapy and is going to have to work with a therapist before that we're going to move forward with parenting or certain parenting orders that they want. But that's the only context in which I see that. I mean, I've had people come to my class and talk about, I think the person whose name I'm trying to think of is Moses something or other, who's social work, a professor at the U, who ran a program for perpetrators. It's been a few years. Anyway. Okay, thanks.
Okay. One quick last question? Anyone? Okay.
I can do one quick last question. What about guns? You guys don't speak up about guns being a problem, even though most people that are killed by firearms. Is that like a political choice to, we aren't getting enough support?
Well,
If we pointed out guns are a problem.
Sorry, when you say we don't speak out about it.
I mean, today here.
Oh, yeah, I really had to cram some information. Obviously very against gun violence. It is one of the highest indicators for a lethality assessment that you're going to be killed by your partner is them owning a firearm or definitely threatening you with a firearm. I would not say that we have taken it to a legislative place with UWC, but certainly not a proponent for gun violence.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of commenting on the people that have pursued legislation about gun violence are just shot down, bad term, are just ignored entirely by the legislature. And I could see that it might not be helpful to curry favor with the legislator to be partnering with folks that are focusing on gun violence.
And just for information, if someone is convicted of a domestic violence offense, so like an assault or criminal mischief where they're damaging property or sexual violence, and there's a domestic violence tag to that case, they are prohibited for 10 years from having a weapon per a federal statute. If someone has a domestic violence protective order against them, that federal statute applies as well. So there is a recognition that there's a correlation between violence and the danger of weapons. And so we do have some state laws as well. And we've struggled in getting the federal government to prosecute on those federal firearm laws, but they do exist. And that would be an opportunity for advocacy to make sure the laws we have on the books are being enforced. But someone does become a restricted person if they have a domestic violence conviction or a protective order.
I've
Okay.
run out of questions.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I have just a couple of announcements.
Do you want me to put in my computer?
That would be good, actually, because there's a lot. So I'll just talk about, this is just a part where I give the upcoming events for the league. So we have, first of all, this isn't on the slide Linda's going to show, but we have the Salt Lake League is going to participate in the March 28th Kings protest. So we are, if you go to our website, it's LWVSL, League of Women Voters Salt Lake.org. And you can, if you go to our website, there's a place there that our guests and members of the public can volunteer, sign up to volunteer to participate in the rally. So that's, and then, we're gonna get it. No, okay. Just a couple of quick things. On March 12th, the League of Women Voters Legislative Action Corps is going to have a Zoom-only legislative wrap-up at 6 p.m. So you can see that on our website as well. April 15th is our next general meeting, and it's going to be Hope for Democracy Begins with the Courage of Young People Who Engage. So I'm really excited about that. We're going to have some great panelists to talk about the importance of engaging younger people in the democratic process. And my voice is just about gone. So, and then there are unit meetings that you can see on our website as well, but I'm not going to go over theirs. Oh, there, you can see it. Okay. You can read that if you can read it. Good job, Linda. Okay, well, thank you to our panelists. You've just been amazing. And thank you to the audience, both on Zoom and here on live. So I think that's the conclusion of our meeting. Thank you.